So we've all heard of AI coding things up, replacing us. Those damn machines. No, we're not talking about that today. What we're going to be talking about, though, is something kind of interesting. So Mike actually wrote up this episode because he has done something that other people have done as well, to be fair. Like, Mike didn't invent this. He's the inventor. No. What we're going to be talking about today is AI, but from the other side. So we think about it right now, it's like, let's just say me, I want to code something up. I don't have the time to do it, or I'm not sure how to quite do it. So I go to ChatGPT, for example, and or one of many other AI assistants, and I go and I type my prompt, and I'm like, I need this in, whatever, JavaScript, sure. And it codes it up in JavaScript for me, and away I go. So we think of it more as I'm the human. I want some code. The AI coded for me. And then I took the code and then now it's human code or something, right? Like, it's more like that mentality. But this is different because Mike's going to be talking about a method that he's been using for his coding more recently that actually complements AI. It's more of like something that we've mentioned a few times on this show and has been mentioned, in the public at large, which is that AI tools right now, at the very least, are more of a human augment. And so it's actually changing the human code. It's changing how the human thinks about their code and how they put it all together. And so it works better with how the machine, the AI, understands the code and can then give you, arguably, a better response. So we're going to get into that this week. So if this sounds interesting to you and you want to support the show, you can go and check us out on that Patreon, leave a review rating on your podcast app, join us in our Discord server, or share this with your friends. And if you want to help out, not only us, but yourself as well, you can do so with up to 20% off a Scrimba Pro plan. You can find the link for that discount in the show description and in the show notes, and full details about those details. Full details can be found about that discount in the show notes on htmlallthethings.com. And remember that we're powered by CodeRabbit. Give yourself the power of AI code reviews to help cut your code review time in half. Check out the link in the show notes and episode description to net yourself a 14-day free trial. No credit card needed, and just a 2-click sign up with a GitHub or GitLab account. So, Mike, I want you to explain this to me. This is AI and humans, coming together rather than the humans demanding, I guess, human code.
You kind of summarized it pretty well, where like before I was doing a lot of just asking the AI to complete certain tasks, and I was getting decent results, but it was very mixed results, right? Like it was very like sometimes it would understand the context of what I wanted, sometimes it wouldn't, and so I would have to prompt it again and again and again until it kind of whittled it down, or I would have to go in and kind of edit it myself, which was the more common thing that I would do. I would just get it to do a very basic run through what I wanted, and then I would go and redo it essentially the way I would want it, keeping some of the structure in place. And that was okay. And that was how I think a lot of people initially used LLMs, like autocompletes and chats and agents. And with kind of the iteration of how people use it, I think the more you use it, the more you realize the limitations of that approach. And naturally, you'll start to change the way you prompt. So you start to provide more details in the prompt. You'll start to provide examples of how you want stuff to look. You'll start to reference different parts of your code base to be like, hey, can you make it look like this? Can you make it look like this? You start to direct the LLM more and more and more as you use it, because you realize that the more direction it has, the more structure you give it, the better chance it gives the output that you want. Right?
Is this something? I'll draw a weird parallel just for the people as a high level example. Is this something along the lines of a Google search query? Now, what I mean by that is we've talked about in the past how Googling, like researching, is an actual skill. And obviously, if I have a question on, like, let's just really basic, like, what is JavaScript, for example? If I ask you that, that's how I'm going to phrase it. Hey, Mike, like, what is JavaScript? But for Google, sometimes you won't phrase your search query the same way. So what is JavaScript would probably work. It's a pretty easy prompt. But you know how, like, you'll add things into your prompt, especially for more advanced things. So you might put like JavaScript description, right, as your search query instead of the more human, what is JavaScript? So is this kind of that where we started almost talking in sort of a different language, again, especially with advanced queries, adding little things or noticing like, hey, it's not, it's giving Google's giving me guides on this coding question, but it's all in Python and I need JavaScript. So I'm just going to tack JavaScript onto the end. And that's not how English works, right? Like, obviously, I don't just go like, how to code JavaScript, like, but that would work in Google. So it's almost like a bit of a different language. And eventually, with the complexity of a different skill. So is that something, is that a parallel maybe here with working with AI as an augment?
A little bit. I think yes. I think natural progression is as you learn to Google, you'll start to use the more advanced features and you'll start to interface with Google a little bit differently than you would have initially, because initially you're just using English and like your regular language to interface with it like you would anyone. And then you start to realize that, hey, if you add these quotation marks, it makes it so that it only gets that information. If you add a plus here, a minus here, like you start to realize the syntax and you start to just get better and better as you iteratively learn to Google, right? This is that, but then taking it to the next level where you're like, hey, I'm learning how to, prompt you. I'm learning how to Google. What if I use Google to make my Googling better? So that's where I'm going with this, if that makes sense. So like
Okay, this is
going
interesting.
deeper, like getting an iterative cycle to provide the best Google search to get the
Okay.
most accurate results back by using the thing that you're going to be asking the results from. It's a weird concept, like it's a completely separate concept to what I was kind of trained on before, but it also started to make sense from a like perspective of software engineering, right?
Okay.
So something that I've a little bit lost due to the speed at which I have to work is the ability to really plan out my next steps. When I was going through like my university education, a lot of what we did there was like writing requirements docs, right? Like we were planning out architecture. Like that was the majority of time that we spent in university was doing those things, doing the actual software planning rather than the implementation. And what I realized with LLMs is that like if you go through through those phases, the regular software development like planning phases, you start to get a really narrow list of specs that need to be created, and it starts to become super clear what you're creating. And I mean, it's the same thing for humans, right? Like it's the same thing. Like if you were to have a really big, software project, you had enough time, you would go through these iterative steps of like creating the spec, writing the requirements, creating an implementation doc. Like you would have all these steps that at least for myself, I haven't had the privilege of doing as much. Like we obviously have requirements docs, but they're just not as detailed as I want them to be. We have implementation docs, but they're maybe not as detailed, or maybe we skip that step because we just get into the code. And I think that's where I had to step a little bit back, is like, why are we diving into the code all of a sudden when we have this opportunity to recreate an actual architecture document, an actual implementation document, a spec document to work from, and have the LLM help us create those docs, first of all, so that saves a ton of time creating the documents, and then feed them back to the LLM to actually start the implementation of those details.
Right.
So it's like using the LLM to create a better prompt, essentially, for the LLM itself to then have a much narrower scope to work in, rather than having to think of all programming that it could possibly bring in. It knows exactly what it needs to do step by step by step by step at the end of this process.
So I'd like to ask a question really quick though on that, because there's something in there that stands out to me. Like you're saying, at the speed you need to work, you guys just get into the code. But like myself, like I will say that I think I work pretty quick, but it doesn't look that way, and it almost looks like I'm being lazy for the first, let's say, couple of days of a project. If it's a big project, it might even be a couple of weeks. It looks like I'm being lazy. But what I like to do is I like to lay everything out, and not slowly. Like it's not like I'm like, well, maybe tomorrow I'll do one function or something like that. I'm not taking my time like that. But what I do is I make sure I have everything, have all like the bills paid if I'm like getting hosting up or something like that, get all the ducks in a row, make notes if I need to. This is if I'm working solo, so I'm less about documentation and more about preparing things for myself, and like making sure all the bills are paid up so I'm not messing with credit cards and things in the past. Maybe pay for the year if it's a year long project, all those things. And then one day it's like unleash. And it's like boom, 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 boom. And like 18 things are done. And like because I'm not like reaching for a wrench, let's say, and there's no wrench there. Reach for the wrench, okay, done with the wrench. Reach for the hammer, got the hammer, done with the hammer. and it's very quick. So would you say that you guys are kind of like if because of the speed at which you work like that, you're almost stumbling a bit? Like, isn't that going to eat more time a little bit? Like, this is another way to go even faster, right? With the LLM, which you'll get into. But like, I'm just curious, like, is it actually saving time skipping those steps in general? Like, obviously, like you can write documents in a quick way or write it in a very like I would, I could show this to anyone and they would understand it, right? Like you can make quick notes for yourselves as a team or as an individual. Doing that is fine to me. Having things be a little sloppy as a team because like, it's behind the scenes, it's not customer facing. But like having no notes at all, like isn't that a bit like, hey, this isn't very sustainable or it's going to be slower in the end? Like I don't know.
Yeah, like I'm exaggerating in the fact that we just sit down and code. Like we definitely have planning phases. We have docs that we write for those situations, and we have like the problem is that a lot of the times those docs are very general. The planning phases are condensed, so it's just not enough. Like we're
Okay.
not writing the diagrams that you would typically write for a large software project. Like you're not doing like the state machines every single time, only for complex features that need the state machines, right? You're not doing the sequence diagrams for certain, networking requests and stuff like that. So like you're skipping a lot of steps. You have rough notes. You have a breakdown with the team of how you're going to tackle something. You sometimes have that jotted down in a step-by-step perspective, and then you jump in. Right? Like that's usually how a feature development works in startups, in like, quick environments. That's how it works. In more enterprise environments, it's more formal. There is like more documentation steps before you even get into the cycle of developing a feature. There's some positives and negatives to that too, because when you're creating the specs for something that is an unknown, and you start creating like a timeline, you start creating requirements for something you don't know, you might be wasting time in that a lot of like for the most part, right? So
Okay.
there is a balance to be played there in traditional software development where like sometimes you do need to jump into code to figure out the unknowns and then jump back into the documents and then jump back into code. Like there might be an iterative like back and forth approach as well. But with this, like with LLMs helping you, they can create very detailed docs very quickly, and then it's on you to review those docs to make sure that it aligns with the implementation that you want to do. And that's really where I find the power of what we're going to be talking about in this, which is spec-driven development, right? This is a kind of a, I don't know if it's a completely new concept, but it's a new concept to me for the most part for LLM, working with LLMs. And the point of it is, again, before, what is spec-driven development? Like before spec-driven development, you were just prompting, you got the LLM to complete a feature, you moved on to the next feature, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, until you've completed like a product. Whereas with spec-driven development, before you start prompting it to write code, what you're doing is actually you're first prompting the LLM to create a set of documents to help you write code. So you're not writing code from the beginning. What you're doing is getting a bunch of implementation details written down and a spec before that kind of dictates how those implementations are going to happen. And the iterative process of creating that spec needs to be inherently a little bit slower than just jumping into code. But when you have a spec that your team can agree on, that makes everything after that, including prompting LLMs, 10 times easier. Because the LLMs can reference the spec document to understand what the limitations are, what they need to achieve to actually complete the project, what kind of technologies they need to work with, what is the final product, what is the actual the top level vision, all the way down into like a schema potentially of the database that you want to create, right? Like it has all of this information condensed into one markdown file that it can then take and then break down into the next steps and next steps and next steps. And having that slightly slower process but accelerated by the LLM has proven, for me at least, to be way, way, way more effective than just jumping into an LLM. Even if you had your own like rough note spec doc written up before that, it's still not enough because the LLM needs more information. It needs more structure. It needs more direction than just a rough note that you have written for like a simple implementation.
For anyone that's like really new out there to coding, maybe they're just like myself, I'm just mostly using ChatGPT for any coding help at the moment. Would you say that this is kind of similar? Obviously, the thing I'm about to say is going to be a simplified version, but similar to like a ChatGPT project And what I mean by that is like you start a project, you can have multiple chats in there, but you can give it a set of parameters. So like I'll just say something really simple for the sake of conversation on this show. So something like if your project is like, I want to build up my social media following, you might only want to actually build up your social media following on LinkedIn. And so that's a parameter you can give that whole project where you're like, whenever I talk about social media and whenever I talk about this and that, I'm talking about how I want to gain followers on LinkedIn. And so then it knows like if I go to a chat and just sort of type in I need a post for today, it knows the context of LinkedIn. Obviously that's a massive oversimplification, but for anybody that's like totally new here, right, like a junior dev or something, is that roughly what's happening here where it's like you're giving this AI more context. It's helping you generate the context and then it has that context and then that's almost like that project context, right? Where ChatGPT is not generating that LinkedIn comment I wrote, but you get the parallel, I guess I'm drawing there.
Yeah, yeah. I think that's a decent parallel. I think mostly what I'm talking about is like how Claude Code or Cursor agents would work with, right? Like because they have more direct access to your code base. But if you want to talk like a more like, general parallel, yes, the idea is that you use the LLM to generate extra context that you then review yourself. This is a really key step too. I want to kind of hammer in that you can't just yeet the spec from one, prompt. It almost every time, I mean, not even almost every single time I've done a spec that I've created using a prompt, I've needed to do multiple cycles of maybe some more prompts to edit it, and I needed to go through by hand and review and add and remove things, because a lot of times the LLM will add a bunch of stuff that you don't need. Like what happens if you like in your testing, you might not be testing certain things, so you just remove that, or you tell the LLM when you're prompting it not to add it in and stuff like that. So there is a lot of back and forth while you're creating that context that you're talking about. And then, yes, it's used for further prompting in like a project sense of every time you're prompting in this feature specifically, you would reference, hey, refer back to the spec to make sure you're on track, right? Like refer back
Right.
to this
Okay.
context. So the context is ever static, and you can obviously go in and change it manually, or you can get it to change what if you have something that changes as you're developing. But it's a really good like static knowledge base that the LLM could always refer to keep your code consistent for whatever feature you're working on. And the other thing that this is that this isn't like something you would do for a full project a lot of times. This is something you would do for a specific feature you're working on, right? So you're working on a feature for having a dark mode toggle on your website, right? So that you would create a spec for that specific feature. And then it would, while you're working on that specific feature, refer back to that spec. And so the narrower you can make it, actually, like the narrower scope, it's going to perform better as far as I understand it, and as far as I've seen myself in the examples that I worked on it with.
So like in the spec, like I've worked with specs a lot in IT, right? Like, oh, like, you're working with a certain protocol or something, and people will say, like, oh, check the spec because like maybe this is failing because like there's a limited data transfer rate or something in this thing, right? Check the spec. So when it comes to this type of spec, it's going to be different. It's going to be less official spec. Obviously, it's not going to be like, hey, this is the protocol for the whole world. This is how it works. So I guess my question there is like, there's going to be code snippets and things in there. There's going to be a lot of information in there. How much of the spec is technical versus like human spec? Where it because like obviously there's going to be like guidelines for humans where it's like, yo, don't call this thing 14 times, like call it once or whatever, things like that, right? And then there's obviously going to be like, hey, we only want to have consts in here for some reason. That would be more technical, I suppose, right? Where it's like, don't be putting vars in here or something, right? Don't be putting lets in here for whatever reason.
There's definitely going to be a mix of both. There's definitely going to be some human spec where like you talk more about like general purpose requirements of whatever feature you're building, and then it is going to trickle down into more like technical spec where you're asking it to use a certain framework, you're asking it to use a certain library, you're asking it to use a certain internal function, like you're asking very specific technical things inside the spec as well. And the main thing that you need from the spec as well is like a way to tell the LLM that it's completed its job, acceptance criteria.
Okay.
So that's a really important aspect of spec, where like the LLM can go in, start doing features, and it can refer back and be like, oh, did I complete any of these acceptance criteria when it's done doing a feature, and then match it up to whatever acceptance criteria it's trying to solve, and then, be more confident in its conclusion. Because a lot of times my biggest issue with LLMs is actually they do too much, and they
Oh yeah,
start to
yeah.
change like 15 different files all of a sudden when I didn't ask them to change those files. But again, limiting their scope and giving them acceptance criteria and giving them an idea of what is actually successful is going to make it a lot easier for them to know when to stop and just be able to like really like,
Focus.
blinders work on the stuff that it needs to work on. So it's a mix of everything. I actually have a example spec that I'm looking at right now that I've created for a dark mode toggle feature for like a random svelte application that we can actually go through a little bit so that we can have an idea of what a spec should have inside of it. I'm not going to go through like every line of what's in this spec, but maybe like the key components of a spec that I see. And the other part of this is that depending on what feature you're working on, the spec might change, like what key components you need in the spec. And a
Right.
lot of times, again, if you can master the spec creation, again, the prompting to create the spec and then the editing of the spec, that's going to make your building a lot easier. So you need to spend more time in this space. And personally, myself too, this is something that I've just started doing probably in the last month or so. So I'm not perfect at creating specs yet. This is something that I'm using some of my education, I'm using some of my experience, I'm using some stuff that I've learned online and trying to create the most comprehensive spec that I can create right now. But I know like 2 months down the line, the specs that I create right now are probably going to be garbage compared to the specs I create 2 months from now. So
So let
this
me
is
ask
going
you a
to
question here.
evolve.
Like, could I? So we have a spec in front of us,
Yeah.
like you mentioned. Can I put this on in the show notes?
Yeah, you can
Is
put it in the
this
show notes. Absolutely. Yeah. It's just a random spec that has nothing to do with actual implementation that I'm
okay?
working
I
on.
didn't know if there was like some privacy stuff in here
No,
because I
no,
was
no.
going to say like if you're listening to this and you're like at a computer and you may want to follow along, I'll put this in here. I'll label it as its title is dark mode toggle spec. And again, for the audio show, obviously we're not going to read everything out because it's an audio show. Or even if we do end up having a video of this, I mean, like it's still
Yeah.
we're still not gonna like read everything out. But if you want to like read along, follow along, or have it in front of you or refer to it after, I'll put it in the show notes on htmlotherthings.com.
Yeah, that's perfect. Yeah. I think it'll be really useful for people to see an example of a spec, but also I would highly recommend you to go in and just like prompt an LLM to create a spec. LLMs understand what a spec means. And the great thing is that they not only understand what a spec means, but they understand the context of what information to include in a spec for a specific feature.
Okay.
Right. So again, like I said, depending on the feature, you'll have different headings, like different sections in the spec. The issue here is, and this is where I said like the back and forth has to happen. You need to go through it yourself and remove certain things or add certain things that it missed, because it will miss certain things based on the project scope. Like it's not perfect at understanding everything from a single prompt. You can get better at prompting, great. But the reality is you're going to have to go through and edit it. You're going to have to remove some things. And if you don't, that might cause more issues than it solves. That's the reality of the situation. So it's actually a really good time right now, maybe just to go through really, really quickly the high level points of the spec that I'm talking about for the dark mode toggle. So we're just going to go through, you're obviously going to have some sort of title and context, like what feature you're creating, why you're creating the feature. It's good for the LLM to understand that, even though it sounds like a human thing, like this is a very human thing. But LLM understanding the reason that it's creating something is going to drive it in certain directions. Again, an objective, maybe a scope section, right? A scope could include what's in scope. For example, like what do you want to control? Like for a dark mode toggle would be UI control for the toggle, the theme state, persisting the state of the toggle, what colors integration, how you're going to be implementing it with like CSS tokens or whatever. What's out of scope, like are you going to change the dark mode, light mode for embedded iframes of your application? No, that's out of scope, right? Are you going to make these styles printable? Is the toggle going to change based on brand? No, that's out of scope. So you can put in and out of scope, and again, that limits like it puts the blinders on a little bit more. The more you can put the blinders on an LLM, the better.
Is
You're
this
gonna yep.
something? So I guess a question here is like we the thing we're looking at right now is in point form.
Mhm.
Is this how generally you would have it be? Like this is like an actual one-to-one example of something that you would actually do. This
Yes.
isn't like point form for the show. Okay,
No,
I
no,
just
no.
wanted to ask.
This is how you would do it. Yeah, you would give it in point form for the most part. Some sections are going to have code snippets. Some sections aren't. Some sections are going to be more verbose. Some sections will be less verbose. But yeah, mostly of point form, mostly mixed in with code snippets and stuff like that.
Okay.
There might be some general paragraph sections, I don't think there are in this one, but I've had a few where I've had like some more in-depth paragraphs, especially when I'm doing it myself. When I'm writing myself, I just sometimes it's easier for me to write it in paragraph form.
Well, the first thing I think of is like in here you write stakeholders, and one of the stakeholders, there's several, but one of the stakeholders is accessibility. You might be doing a very specific accessibility feature for like a
Mhm.
very specific accessible thing, and that would require like a paragraph.
Yeah,
Because it might be like, hey, why is this like this, this color that, doesn't match the design? And it's like, well, it's, colorblind, and this version of colorblindness, because there's different types of colorblindness and blah, blah, different things. Like I would imagine something like that, first thing off the top of my head, but I would imagine something like that would be a paragraph and not just like a quick, like, whoop.
right. Yeah, that's correct. You might have a constraint section, so make sure that there's no JavaScript errors. Make sure that there's no layout shift after completion, right? So that it doesn't affect your Lighthouse score. Those are constraints. You're gonna have definitely gonna have something to do with interfaces, which is essentially a typing systems. Like what types what types are gonna be available, what types you want to create. So for again the dark mode toggle, you'll probably create a mode type which will have light, dark, and system. You might create a version inside that type. You might have a JSON schema for the whole thing that needs to be typed of like, again, it's going to have the mode in there. It's going to have it, is it required or not? And you're probably going to have a store. So if this is a Svelte application, you're going to need somewhere to store that information. That's going to be a store, and it might have local storage, it might not in there as well. So like information, there'll be some code in this section in the way of like TypeScript types or whatever other system you're working with. It can be pretty rough. This is something that I want to explain as well, is like in a spec doc, your code doesn't have to be runnable code. It can be pseudocode. It can have mixed in comments in between that explain like what something before it and after it will be. It's very, very rough code, so that the LLM has an idea, or yourself, whoever's working on it, has the idea of what's supposed to be put together and how it's supposed to be put together, but not actually putting it together. You might have states, right? So in this, you would have states of light, dark, system. Like what states is the feature gonna have to it? What the states mean? So like what does system actually mean? Well, it means take it from the actual system, take it down, and the system could be light or dark too. And the system in this, just a quick one, refers to what you have your system set to. So if on Android you can set dark and light mode, on Windows, on Mac OS you can set it, and websites can actually read that information. You'll have accessibility requirements. Again, accessibility requirements is a really good example of a specific one for this feature. Like especially if you're creating a backend feature, you probably wouldn't have accessibility requirements as a section in your spec, right? Because it's not relevant. But if you're creating a front end feature, for sure you would have it. Let's see, performance. So that one, like if I was actually doing this spec, I would probably just remove it, because who cares about performance on a toggle, like on a dark and light mode toggle? That's a really good example of like, that's not needed. Like you don't.
Well, here's a question
Mhm.
on that though. So like, yeah, like the amount of performance. Let's just say, for the sake of conversation, it's a 1 millisecond is at stake. 1 millisecond. So if you do it badly, it's going to be at most 1 millisecond slower load time. My question, I guess, is that how many times, I guess, does this performance section get cut in not just this, but a whole bunch of other specs that you have, and then you have to go back and be like, holy crap, guys, and then we have to, or is that more of a refactor stage where it's like, hey, yo, okay, we need those milliseconds back. Like, we're at 40 milliseconds now. Like, what's going on here?
Yeah, I don't see this ever being an issue for something like a feature like this, like a dark mode
This is
toggle.
pretty low
Yeah,
stakes. Yeah, low stakes.
but if it was like a feature of querying a database for thousands of entries, like it involved that part, then I would probably not remove the performance section right off the get-go, right? Because I would want it to keep performance in mind. So it's really a case by case basis. Most of the time you probably wouldn't remove it, but if you're creating some random feature like this, like it doesn't make sense. And
So
again,
I guess oh, sorry, go ahead.
no, go ahead.
I was gonna say, like, the point is that these specs are gonna be like very different. So like, for example, if you're making the Facebook app, the performance section of this spec might be gone. However, if you're making that lightweight Facebook app, which I think is literally called Facebook Lite, performance is probably in all of their specs, because they're like, yo, we can't be having the device process like anything superfluous.
It's very true, yeah, and like specifically, something I want to kind of point out is you wouldn't make a spec for the Facebook app, in my opinion. Like, and this might be just my opinion. You would make a spec for a feature inside the Facebook app.
Sure, for
If
sure,
you
yeah.
want to make an app, like if you're going vibe coding route, right? I think it would be a little bit different where you're creating a requirements doc, you're creating a PRD. Like you would have many steps before you would get to the specs of the features, right? And then but you could do that in with with LLM prompting and then break it down into specs, break down each feature into a spec doc, and then go about like kick off a bunch of different feature developments like that, and then that would actually be a really good strategy. But having a single spec for an entire application, that would make it so that it's too wide a scope, and you would run into the same issues as before.
Especially Facebook, like they do
Correct.
events, pictures, videos, text, like, and that's just scratching the surface.
Absolutely, yeah, that's exactly it. You might, and again, one of the biggest things in this doc will be the acceptance criteria, in my opinion. What does it mean for this to actually be complete? That's essentially all that acceptance criteria means. So like all pages and styles use tokens, no hard coded colors. This is actually a really good one because I've had situations where when I was just prompting the LLM without any sort of guidance or without any cursor rules, it would do some really hacky things to complete a task. Because it's in its mind, it's like it just needs to complete the task a lot of times.
Right, right.
So like for example, I've had tests written where it would literally like put the success criteria inside the test rather than testing something. And so it would just pass all the tests, but it wouldn't actually test anything. Or it would test it, return whatever result, and then still have the static criteria of it passing. So like completely useless test, but it passed. So that's all that mattered. So like adding stuff like, hey, don't use static coded, hard coded values, don't use this, don't use that, like don't put console errors or something into private, like don't giving it some limitations will actually make it think a little bit harder and not do as many hacky solutions as it would do without that.
This is like reminds me of like that one bot that they taught to play Tetris, and the only goal they said was don't lose, and so it just paused at the end when it was going to inevitably lose. And it's like
Genius.
technically that's a check mark, but it's like yeah, but now no one else can ever play this. Like theoretically,
Exactly. Like that's how these things think sometimes, and you need to guide them away from that a lot. But that's really it for the spec. I don't really want to go too far more into it. There's way more. Matt's gonna post it on the website, so definitely check it out. See, like, let us know what you would remove, what you would add too. That would be really an interesting exercise. At HTML everything on X or Twitter or whatever, HTML things on all the other platforms. So like, let us know. Really curious to hear what how everyone would change that spec to actually build the best feature. Because again, I don't think it's the best spec. I've already pointed out things that I would remove while we were doing this little review, right? And that's the process that I'm talking about, that you have to do yourself when you're creating the specs. You can't just eat them and go about your day. The next section that I want to talk about is like, why do this? I already mentioned it a lot, the reasons that I think, but just high level reasons here. Lower hallucinations, 100%. You're going to have, when you constrain what the LLM needs to do, it's going to provide it with much more direct access to success rather than having it come up with solutions or go down a million different rabbit holes. That's going to lead to a lot more hallucinations. Makes it so that prompts become cheaper. So again, when you have to prompt for a massive feature, a lot of times you're writing a shit ton of text. Where you have something that you can reference that's very clear and concise, then your prompts can be a lot shorter as well. So a lot of times, because you have the spec doc, you can actually kind of go really quickly on your prompts. Like, hey, do the first part of the spec doc. That's literally sometimes what I do. Or create the implementation for the first part. Let's do the first part. And like that iterative, like really quick, almost human approach is how you would like, work with the team or with yourself sometimes in your own brain, is just a more natural language approach rather than putting a bunch of text into the prompt. Enables automated evaluations. Again, acceptance criteria. This is really important. Something that I didn't have before I started spec-driven development was the acceptance criteria, and that's made a huge difference. Supports parallelization. This one's really cool, actually. This is something that I'm starting to experiment with. Essentially, when you create a spec, then you create some implementation documents, and I'll talk about implementation documents in a second. But when you after the creation of a spec, you'll create like maybe 5 or 6 different things that you need to build out to complete that spec. right? Like if it's a big feature, you might need quite a few different features inside of it that you need to build out. And those implementation docs will have like to-dos that they need to that the actual LLM will need to do to complete that. And because you can split it out like that, you can actually run multiple agents on doing all of those specs at the same time, as long as they're not like reliant on each other, as long as they don't have dependencies, and speed up the process of creating these features. So having multiple agents running in the background and then reviewing them one at a time is a pretty crazy workflow. It's like you have a team working for you at the same time. Each one of those agents can actually create a separate pull request too, so that you don't have any like merge conflicts and stuff like that. Very interesting workflow, something that I'm very much early in experimentation with, but I can see a huge benefit of when you're
Well,
working
I
like
was actually
alone.
going to ask you, like, at what point? I've never tried an agent. Like, maybe I should try one just
Mhm.
to play with it. But like, at what point is the management? Like, are you just playing manager? I guess is a better way to say that.
Yeah, a
At
lot of
what
time.
point are you just playing manager of these agents, and then like you're coding a little bit? Obviously, you're fixing the specs, you're fixing the code they're generating, I assume, and things like that. But that's a little crazy, isn't it? Like, it just seems like all of a sudden you become like an AI administrator or
Well,
something.
you become an engineering manager, like you become a tech lead or whatever. Like you become someone that
Yeah.
reviews more code than writes code. And that's the
Right.
natural progression of like engineers. Like as you become more senior, you'll review more code than you write because that's just
Right.
going to be more important for the team than writing the code. So,
You work your
yes.
way to the overlord, if you
Yeah,
will.
so you are accelerating that. So once you start down this path, you're actually going to become a better developer because again, if you can review the code successfully, that's a quite a big if because this is really difficult. Like reviewing, 5 different agents work one after the other. You're gonna find shit they screw up. Like it's just the inevitability of how these LLMs work. And so you're gonna have to fix that stuff and stuff. So that takes time. Like not it accelerates you, but also slows you down. It's always that back and forth. We've talked about it on the podcast before, where it's like this isn't going to make you 100 times faster because you're still going to have to review all the lines of code. You're still going to have to do it. But what it allows you to do is become faster at doing complex things, right? Like you
Right.
can do more in that time
Or
frame.
capable of even
Yeah,
complex
or
things,
just
because
more capable of doing things that are more complex because of the ability to offload some of that like unknown to an LLM and then test that unknown and make sure that LLM can prove that it works.
it's kind of like, I mean, like, with some controversy, but it's kind of like government bureaucracy, where like there's a lot of bureaucracy forms and things, but also, like, could you imagine as an individual trying to plan, like, okay, we have commuters in this town, or people moving from this city to this town, so they need to commute to this city. How are we going to get them over here? Well, we don't have a public transit. Okay, let's get a public transit. Oh, okay, but like now we don't have the amount of people, taking that public transit. Okay, so now we need marketing to market that there's now a bus, and then we need this bus there. Oh, wait, we have another law that states it can't be a diesel bus, it's got to be an electric bus, but there's nowhere to charge. These buses need to charge because they were only intercity buses. So now we have an issue with, you see my point. Like, it's like, okay, like there's kind of a reason. Annoyingly, like, I will admit, like, anyone and everyone is annoyed by bureaucracy, I'm sure. But like there is a reason why governments are the ones that are doing these complex things. Cause like, I mean, how many like projects do they screw up? A lot. But like, if they didn't have that bureaucracy, how much bigger would those screw ups be? I don't have the answer to that. I'm gonna guesstimate that it's quite a bit. It's quite a, it'd be a probably pretty like, yeah, we just threw a couple diesel engines in there, and and then we couldn't, so then we put a couple electric, and now they just stall in the middle of the road. It's like, well, that's not good.
No big deal. Yeah. No,
Just
you're
leave them
right.
out there.
Yeah. You're right. Like you're adding more complexity a little bit by being the manager of these things, but you can do a hell of a lot more. Like it's just kind of insane the capacity that you increase if you once you start getting into the rhythm, especially of this, because I think the ramp up is a little bit hard. Like just I think it's probably better to start with one agent at a time. Like definitely don't just jump in and like 15 agents and go ham. Like start one agent, figure out how they work, figure out the limitations, and then once you're confident, expand that to more agents. Similar to how a regular person would work, like a manager. Like you start managing a small team, and then as you get better, you can manage more and more and more. until
Well,
there's a limit.
the thing I'm kind of curious about though is like at what point in your learning journey do you do this? Because like this isn't a company that's like promoting you to the manager of the agents. This is like, you know, you doing this maybe even as a freelancer, you know, so you effectively are your own boss with a small or no team beneath you. And it's like if you're someone here listening, lots of junior developers listen to this show. It's like at what point do they start worrying about, you know, AI agents? That might be an episode in and of itself, to be honest. Like it's kind of getting a little off topic, a little on topic, off topic. But like you see what you see where I'm coming from.
Yeah, no, I see what you're coming from. I see where you're coming from. This isn't. I don't want to gatekeep this for too long. That's the other thing. Is like I think you do need a good core set of skills. Like we've talked about that a bunch of times to be able to review the code that the agents put out. That's the biggest blocker, right? Like you need to be able to understand what what code the agent puts out and be able to at least that to some degree be able to push back and edit that code. If you can't do that, then you shouldn't use this method. That I think is pretty clear. But as soon as you have some confidence in your ability to be able to push back on an LLM, then jump in and just try it. And even if you don't have the confidence, jump in and try it and see if maybe you do have those skills. Because again, the skills of reviewing code are a little bit different than writing code. So who knows? You're not going to know until you try. But as soon as you get to the barrier of like, I don't know what this guy's doing, the guy I'm referring to as an agent, then you have a very steep hill to climb. Like you need to figure out what they're doing. If you don't understand their implementations, then yeah, you're going to let a lot of issues slide.
I suppose with that too is you can like you could even like if you're like, hey, like I'm just learning like frameworks now or something, and you know all the pillars like the HTML, CSS, and JS, you could have your agent just write your CSS for you, and then you could
Absolutely.
push back in that very specific, even beginner area. Like I feel like even myself, I'm like, oh, like agents are too advanced. It's like, yeah, but they're capable of advanced things, but they don't have to do those things. I could just be like, yo, you just do the CSS.
Yeah, absolutely. You can limit it to whatever scope you want, and with a spec, you can do that even easier. Hey, you're only a CSS guy.
Yeah, you're only a CSS guy and
Yeah,
don't use any SAS or
exactly.
whatever.
Easy. Just HTML and CSS. So that would be part of your spec. Last thing I have here for why spec-driven development works really well, easier handoffs. So if you can imagine for every feature you write a spec, imagine how easy and documented your code is going to be or your implementation is going to be for the next person that needs to, build on top of that feature. They have an entire history of what you've done, all the implementation details written in really succinct short form format that's human readable rather than going through like code line by line. So it makes documentation of the code base self-documented, right? Your entire, like if this is the way that you implement code, like this is what you push for the entire team to do, that code base is going to be hella documented. Maybe
Oh
over
yeah.
documented, maybe. Like that's another consideration, but as long as you have a good spec organization system, right? Like how you organize where your spec docs go and stuff like that, it should be fairly easy to follow and you go to a certain spec for a certain feature and stuff like that. It is a kind of a killer side effect almost, or a side benefit. So
So
what's
how
next?
long?
Yeah.
Sorry, I was gonna actually ask. So like, this is due to you, and like, there's like, this is like, how long has this been developing? Like, how? Because like, this kind of seems like it's kind of invaded like all of your code processes, right? Like, you don't have like on this project I'm doing my old way, and on my new project I'm doing like this new way. Like, this is kind of like, how long did it take you to develop this? Because like, this is one of those contexts where like this is, you know, for the sake of an audio show, we're not diving into everything, like not even everything in that spec, right? And that was even a basic spec. So this is actually like quite a comprehensive like process change or, you know, difference. And AI is pretty new to the point where, you know, some people might still just be introducing themselves based on their busyness level or something. So it's hard to say like, you know, this is the master, you know, this person is the master of AI. It's like master of the 2 year AI. Yeah, sure. Like, I guess, you know what I'm trying to say though?
Yeah.
So like how long did this take you to sort of, I guess, develop? Was it gradual? Is this something where if someone is at your level of like coding, should they be like really trying to like figure out their own like what, you know, what's the feel there?
It's a good question. So for me personally, I think it was about a month of iteration on this process. Before I even knew the term of spec-driven development, I started doing it to a certain degree. Like I started to get help, like I started to get LLM help on generating prompts with more and more
Okay.
details, right? Like that was the first iteration of this for me. Is like, hey, my prompts are probably weak. Let me ask an LLM, which knows prompt engineering really well, to help me get better prompts, edit those prompts down, get the prompts to where I want it, then prompt back. So that was the first step. Then the next step was like, hey, it seems weird to have to generate these prompts. Why don't I just generate them in a document and then refer to those documents and have the agents refer to the documents when it needs to build something? So that's another step. And then the next step was learning of what spec-driven development was, which I actually learned from a couple things. One is a new IDE launch, like a new code editor launch called Kiro.dev, which is a VS Code fork, another VS Code fork from Amazon. And it is designed and built with spec-driven development first. So
Okay.
every, like when you go to code, your first step is always going to be to create a spec for whatever you're coding, right? So that's how dedicated they are to this approach. And I like, when I was looking it up, I saw like, hey, spec-driven development, that sounds cool. And I realized that, hey, I'm kind of doing a cross section of this, not exactly. And I started to look into that, into spec-driven development a little bit more and realized that, hey, there's a lot more to this that could benefit me. And I started to iterate on that as well. So that whole process, probably only a month. Before that, I was using the more traditional like prompting approach, and that was working okay. But again, it wasn't that great. This has been much more consistent, right? And that's really where a lot of LLM stuff failed for me, is like the consistency of it was really difficult. I would literally sit down one day, have a really good session and have like really good productivity, and the next day almost the same feature would be a disaster because it's just like coming up with shit. And like people keep saying like, hey, these LLMs keep degrading or whatever. I think it's just inherently in their scope of like, sometimes they interpret something one way and then sometimes they interpret something completely differently because they're kind of like not thinking obviously, but they're kind of coming up to these solutions without predictability. They
Well, they're
inherently,
our first like floaty computer system.
yes, exactly, they're a non-deterministic.
Yeah, like if you press post on Facebook, it opens up. I mean, I haven't done this in a long time, but I imagine it opens up the thing where it's like, are you posting a picture or a text or whatever? That little like menu invocation always happens. It doesn't give it to an LLM and it's like, well, open up which
Maybe.
one you think,
Yeah.
you know?
Yeah, that's exactly it. Yeah.
Open up the picture uploader. Sure, they wanted to type in like, hey, I'm doing something. They wanted to type that in text, but just open that picture uploader, upload the latest picture, press post,
Yeah.
do it up.
Yep, exactly. So it's a completely new paradigm, and I think we're learning how to work with the paradigm. Now, having said that, like I don't think spec-driven development is going to be the final stage of this. I think there's going to be more, like more evolutions that we're going to be looking into, and I think we're going to get better at spec-driven development, and then we'll find something else that's even better. We might make an LLM that specifically works well with a certain style of coding. Like
Oh,
we might have
likely.
smaller, more dedicated LLMs. Anyway, there's just like a million different things that could happen, and I want to continue to report my progression through this because I think it's important to talk about it. And like I think right now I'm okay. Again, I think a month or two from now, looking back, I'll be like, I was an idiot. This is how I should have been doing things. That's an important aspect of like learning new concepts, right?
Well, I guess like the way you're talking too, like you weren't necessarily focused on iterating on this either. You were just sort of like, hey, this, the problematic area, I'll fix that. Problematic area, I'll fix that. It wasn't like you decided to like take a month off or whatever and make this thing and iterate on it. You were just sort of like, yo, this is problematic. Let me try it this way. Let me try it that way. And then eventually, like a system's kind of born effectively, right? And then of course it's, then it was spec driven and you found it is kind of like something that, people do or whatever. And but like the point is like you drew your own conclusion and you didn't just like you weren't researching this topic. Like some people I think, and even myself included, like if you just read this like on the onset, you're like, oh my god, like Mike took a month off of coding and took all this time to like develop really a productivity system, alongside an AI. And it's like that's not what happened here. Like you were still doing regular, coding and doing whatever the heck you do on the daily. But then this system was born slowly as you like really field tested and field built it, I guess you could say.
Yeah, exactly. Like I'm never comfortable with my systems. I think that's another thing is like I'm never like, this is it. This is the perfect thing. I'm gonna just keep it this way. I'm always kind of looking what could be better. Like, and it's always going to be very small iterations on that. I'm never going to be like, oh, that's it. I'm not doing it this way. I'm just going to go and learn how to do a completely different way for a month. It's always going to be that small, iterative, step-by-step process until it becomes a more radical change over time. Like this, again, I was being productive for the whole month in different ways. Like even with the old way, right? Like I was still being pretty productive. It just, I had pain points that I tried to solve along the way. That's it.
Right.
So spec-driven development, creating the spec, what's next, right? Like what is the next step when you create that spec? I want to talk a little bit about that before we end the episode. Now, I talked about it again a little bit before, but what I typically do with that spec doc, which is a very high level document for the entire feature or entire section of the application that you're trying to build, I will typically break that down into smaller feature implementation specs or implementation docs. I should be clear there. These docs are going to be smaller or bigger, it doesn't matter, but they're going to be focused on one little part of the spec, right? Like if there's going to be in a spec of like something to do with database, a database addition plus a front end plus maybe some API creation step, an implementation talk could be only referencing like the database migration stuff, right? Like it can only be adding fields to the database. The next implementation step would be, adding the APIs, and the next implementation step would be doing the UI, right? So you would break down one spec into three steps. And that, again, those steps are typically a little bit more detailed in how you want to do certain things. Like if the spec was just very high level, hey, I need to add these fields to the model and here's what they kind of look like, the implementation doc will actually have like more structured code examples, talk about the exact area of your application that you want to edit, if you have multiple schemas or something like that for the database, and just provide way more context for the LLM. So it has not only the spec for the full feature and the overview of what it's creating, it also has an even narrower scope to do one specific feature when it's working on the actual, like when the LLM actually kicks off and starts coding. So the more you can trickle that down, like the more scope, the more narrow you can make it, the more feature docs you can create, the better. At some point you can't do this infinitely. So this is a time management kind of practice where like you need to create those feature docs. You can use the LLM to create them. That's great, but you still need to edit them as well and iterate on that. So you can only do so much. You can do them one at a time. You can create them all at once. Up to you on that one, depending on how much time you have. But the more you have, the easier it is for your LLM to kind of stay on track. And I found like when you have both the spec and the feature doc, holy crap, does it like just run through and do exactly what you say. Like I have very minimal edits I have to do at the end of a agent session when it has that much information, because I've already done the edits, right? Like it's not like I haven't put in that work. I've actually gone into like the sample code snippets and changed things. I've gone into the spec and changed things. Like I've done a bunch of work up front to make the actual coding process even simpler. And these docs will also include to-dos. I don't know, Matt, I don't think you've used Cursor or Claude Code yet, but a lot of these new agent style agents will initially create a list of to-dos, and you'll see this in the UI when it's doing like its thinking process. It'll create like an actual like to-do list and then tackle each to-do one by one, and you'll see what to-do it's tackling, and then when it finishes it off, it'll actually like visually check that to-do off as it's working. And that makes it, again, it really confines the scope of what it's working on because it's only working on that one to-do. And in the implementation docs, I actually create those to-dos or have the LLM create those to-dos in there so that I can monitor and change and stuff like that before it even kicks off. So it just takes the to-dos from there, puts it into its own scope, and starts going one by one, and you could see it thinking and going through. It's really, really cool when you have the to-dos there. I've noticed that has increased the capacity, like the ability of the LLMs quite a bit. Again, I think it's because it allows them to kind of narrowly think about one certain thing.
Do you think that there would be value in, like, this is like a random question at this point, but like there'd be value in like maybe even producing a piece of content of like introduction to like Cursor and Claude and all that? Because like obviously I use LLMs to like help me code, and I'm like coding like real life paid projects, but I don't like, I just use VS Code still. Like I'm just using VS Code.
VS
I'm
Code can do all
using,
this too. Just FYI. They all
with is it limited to Copilot though? Like GitHub Copilot?
no,
Or
you can
no?
use, I believe their agents can use multiple different models. They don't limit it.
Okay.
Like their agent,
Well, like
yeah.
I'm so out of the loop, like I'm not even sure what that meant.
Okay, fair enough. Yeah.
Like I still just like I'm still very much doing like AI, give me code that I would
Mhm.
normally write, right? Like I'm not in this world yet, I guess.
So yes, TLDR, yes, there is some value in doing some beginner content for people to understand how this stuff works. There is some good beginner content out there, I should say. Like there are people that are creating this stuff, like talking about how they're doing it. But I think there is still quite a bit of space for more of that because it's just not propagating enough. And this stuff moves so quickly that again, like I could show you spec-driven development today, and then 2 months down the line, it'll be completely different potentially. So you just have to
Crazy.
keep on
Like
top of it.
literally
Yeah.
crazy.
Yeah, for sure. 100%. The final thing that I'll say is one upgrade you can do, like if you need extremely reliable code written by the LLMs. So as you do all these spec things, like that's good. Implementation doc, that's an even a bigger upgrade. The final thing you can do is in your implementation doc, put in that the LLM has to use test-driven development. And what that does is essentially it makes it so that the LLM will create all the test cases first before it even jumps into writing code. And then anytime it actually creates any piece of code, it'll rerun the test to make sure it passes. And so the failure rate of that is very low because it's literally testing against things that it needs for completion. The completion criteria are essentially created inside of like coding tests, and it is able to use that in its own like coding environment to test against when it's writing code. So it's like
Right.
even more reliable. You just keep adding these layers onto it. Now, all the stuff that I'm saying will slow it down. So that's where and it's going to cost more as well. So that's where the balance is. Like, you want reliable code. It's probably going to have to be a slower development cycle, just like with real life. With LLMs, it's the same way, just still more accelerated.
Well, like, what do you mean by slow, really? Like, is it literally gonna take, like, an hour to generate some code? Or, like, what?
I've been able to limit my scope pretty narrowly to not have that happen, but I have a few people, like a few colleagues that I work with that are testing out this method that have had, yeah, hours long agent workflows. Yeah.
So it'll just be, like, generating, like, the whole
Like an
time.
hour or 2 or 3. Yeah. Yeah.
Wow, okay.
Yeah.
Because
And
I was thinking, like,
that's why those background agents are so important is like if you have something that big and it's that detailed, you'll throw it to a background agent and then you can continue working on whatever in your own thing. And the background agent will essentially like do its own thing and then create a pull request. So it's not like editing the code that you're currently talking about. It's editing in its own environment. So it like takes a
right.
branch, starts editing, and then we'll create a pull request with all the details of what it did inside the pull request review. And then you can go in and like a normal software like project, you can go in and review it and ask it to change things.
That's a good point, because I was thinking, like, when you were like, "Yeah, it's like having a team," I was like, "Yeah, but a team where I was expecting everything to be virtually instant." So it'd be like, "Hey, you do this," like, "Hey," and it's
No.
done. It's like, "Well, hang on. I haven't told the other 4."
Yeah,
Like,
yeah.
"Everyone hang on here, like, hold up," you know?
Yeah. Yeah, because
Okay.
it literally like will have to run your code base. And sometimes running a code base, like for like where I'm working right now, could take minutes just to run it. And then it'll have to run whatever test it needs to run against that code base in its virtual environment. And that'll take time. And then it'll have to see what the output of the logs is, and that'll take some time. And then it'll have to iterate on that, and it'll have to like spin down the server, run the server again. So even just doing that kind of stuff, like regular developer stuff, takes time, regardless of like the generation stuff. So it's a weird concept, but it could, yeah, depending on your code base, it could be hours.
Interesting.
Yeah.
I kind of want to try these things. Like, I don't know if I'm going to do this like whole spec thing yet, but it'd be kind of cool just to try, because I haven't tried any agents at all.
Yeah,
Like, and I know
yeah.
agents can be used not just on code. Like, they can be used, I believe, just like there's general use agents, I
There's
guess,
general
that
use
could like
agents, yeah.
research for you is
Computer
what I
use
have
agents
seen.
as well, like where they can use your computer for different things.
Hate that. Don't like that.
But they can,
Don't
yeah.
like that at
Well,
all.
they can spin
I'd
up
like
their own
give it its
environments
own
too.
computer.
Yeah, it could spin up its own environment too.
Here's this VM with
Yeah.
no internet connection.
Yeah,
Figure
yeah.
it out.
That'd be cool. But yeah, that's it. I think that's spec-driven development. That's what I'm working on right now. That's my new flow. Definitely cool. If you want more information, again, yeah, reach out.
Cool. I mean, this is a new thing to me. Like, I mean, it all makes sense. Like when you say it, like it's not like complex in that it's like hard to understand, like an algorithm or something. It's just like something that you've clearly iterated upon, put it all together, And it just makes sense. Like, it's just like now somebody could like literally start at this step rather than, doing several iterations. Like, I'm sure there'll be iterations to be had for their unique use cases, but they can, now start at this like much further step. You can start at step 5, figuratively speaking, rather than starting at step 1 and iterating just the very basics. So an interesting topic for sure.
100%.
But I think that's it. Like Mike said, if you want to support episodes like this, you can do so on Patreon. That is patreon.com/HTML, all the things. Check out the tiers and give that a go. And many thanks to our $3 tier patrons: Tim from The Web Hacker on thewebhacker.com, Jason from Geek Life Radio via geekliferadio.com, Garrett Segal, Level Up Financial Planning via www.levelupfinancialplanning.com, Magnus from YesWeb via yesweb.se, Syntaxify from the HTML All the Things Discord server, and Stacy Mosteler from the website swoonworthydesigns.com. And just a reminder that we are powered by Code Rabbit. They give you the power of AI code reviews to help cut your code review time in half. Check out the link in the show notes and episode description to net yourself a 14-day free trial, no credit card needed, and just a 2-click sign up with a GitHub or GitLab account. And last but not least, we'd like to give a shout out to Michael LaRocca, a contributing author on HTMLAllTheThings.com. Michael is the author of Self-Taught the X Generation blog at selftaughttxg.com. And remember, if you want to help out yourself, if you're like, man, whatever Mike and Matt are talking about was just a mess, I don't understand any of it, you can go and get some formal courses. You can do so with 20% off. We have a 20% off Scrimba link. You can net yourself a Scrimba Pro plan for that discount. You can find that link in the show description and in the show notes. Full details about the link will be in the show notes on HTMLAllTheThings.com. Feel free to leave a comment or a review in the platform you're listening to this on, and this outro will sign us off.
You've been listening to HTML All the Things podcast. Web development, web design, and small business. We hope you've gotten some useful and practical information from this show. And we hope you appreciate that we talk to you like human beings. And we hope you had some fun. We'll be back soon. But in the meantime, hit us up on social media on Facebook, Instagram, and Patreon at HTML All the Things. And on Twitter at HTML Everything. Until next time, this is HTML All the Things, signing off.